In its day, Glasgow was both spacious and elegant. But with time it became more and more congested. Its population increased. Its boundaries were stretched. Glasgow was overcrowded.
The profile of poor health within Scotland is well known. The scale of public health issues is considerable and accounts for in excess of 5,000 deaths every year. This figure is most pronounced within the country's largest city, Glasgow. For decades, the City of Glasgow has experienced lower life expectancy rates than any other region in the UK. What was once an unexplained phenomenon is the consequence of a long history of poverty and socio-economic deprivation.
If you want to know why health is worse in Glasgow than elsewhere, the most important reason is poverty and deprivation. Poverty and deprivation are the main drivers of poor health in all societies, be that Scotland, be that Europe, be that wherever. And Glasgow is the most deprived city in Scotland and is among the most deprived cities in the UK.
Overcrowding and poor housing conditions have made up a major part of Glasgow's history. Although comparable industrial regions such as Liverpool and Manchester were overrun with a similar issue, research comparing the cities found notably higher levels of deprivation in Glaswegian slum areas.
Historically, people in Glasgow were living in worse conditions, so as evidenced by overcrowding. So if you look at trends going back to the 1940s, 1950s in terms of income-based poverty, there's very little difference between the cities. If you look at overcrowding levels going back in time, Glasgow is completely different. So for example, in the 1970s, early 1970s, overcrowding in the worst parts was about 3 times higher than in the worst parts of Liverpool and Manchester. And so that's relevant in a number of ways. It's relevant in terms of the actual issue of living in an overcrowded house, which is relevant for different aspects of health. But more broadly, it's a kind of proxy for worse living conditions generally for different aspects of housing conditions, and therefore a proxy for different aspects of deprivation that are not picked up when you just look at income.
In response to overcrowding, mass slum clearances took place. Areas such as the Gorbals were demolished, and the focus turned to producing council estates and high-rise developments, many of which were poor quality. Despite large-scale urban change, investments in housing maintenance were low, with families living in poor housing arrangements well into the latter half of the 20th century.
The living conditions were pretty grim. When I came to Govan, I stayed in a room and kitchen. You had to go outside to the toilet. It's as simple as that. Outside toilet was shared by 3 families, and I think there were about 11 people sharing the one toilet. That was normal up until the housing association started to give people houses with the baths, showers, indoor toilets, and this was a revolution. I can't emphasise how much of a difference that's made to the living conditions of people. And the rest of Glasgow started to follow suit.
A key event that drove the population into a further state of vulnerability was the socially selective New Towns programme of the 1960s.
New towns, but where? Most of the Clyde Valley was already built up. Much of the remainder was designated as Greenbelt. Some was too valuable as agricultural land or too rich in minerals. But 15 miles to the northeast of Glasgow, there was one possible site.
This programme was the start of a regional modernisation agenda designed to divert industry away from the inner city. It held the promise of modern housing and factories, new employment opportunities, and a restart for many families. Sections of the population were selected for relocation.
When they built the new towns to deal with the population overspill, with shortage of houses, not everyone was allowed to move to a new town. You had to have a skill, you had to have a trade. They targeted particularly younger families with children. And there's explicit mention in some of the government documents from the time that we found of skimming the cream of the population. But the really crucial point about it is that they themselves were aware of the problems this was having in creating this vulnerable population, but they kept doing it for decades. There was all sorts of problems facing Glasgow in terms of housing shortages and housing quality. There were actions taken first by local government to try and address that. They were not very well thought out and created problems for the city. But in addition, there were actions taken by the Scottish Office, which is obviously the department of the UK government responsible for implementing UK policy, which again had a further adverse effect on the population. And so they were aware of the problems facing the city. They had no confidence that what local government was doing was going to solve the problems. So they embarked on a series of policies that you can only really describe as writing off the city. Glasgow was officially designated a declining city. All economic investment was to be made away from the city. As part of that process, they moved industry away and also sections of the population.
Have you any idea why it hasn't worked?
Well, I think basically it's the sheer size of this place. I mean, although in the Gorbals there were very long streets, they were all divided by narrower streets. Therefore, you'd maybe 4 closes, and this, you know, everyone could identify with these 4 closes. And whereas in this place you've got a street, you've got Adam Craig Road, that's about 3 miles long. People can't see each other. And then again, it's the distance you're away from work. Men have to get up at, say, 6 in the morning, go to work. They're not home till 6 at night, time they have a meal. And then if they want to go out again, it takes them another 3/4 of an hour to get into the city. So there's very little to do up here. There's nothing, in fact.
What was designed to provide new and modern facilities resulted in a breakdown of community and further hardships and loss of employment for those left behind. Communities vanished. Those rejected for relocation were forgotten and left in an inner city with fewer opportunities.
What really took the heart out of Govan was when they started knocking down the tenements. And they were sending people to live in Pollock, Priest Hill, Drumchapel, you know, all the big schemes. But it took the heart out of Govan.
The most important elements in such a community was the small shopkeeper, like Mrs. Elliott.
These houses here were all kept practically for the one families, aunties and cousins and nieces and grandmas, and everything was all concerned with the one crowd here. There wasn't many really strangers in the street. There were an awful lot of the one families in the street. And of course everyone was out to help one another in these days. Anything went wrong, they knew the neighbour to run for what was to be sorted out.
There was meant to be this new experience moving up there in the 60s and 70s, and it was all going to be this community, but what happened instead was actually a breakdown of community.
The Glasgow of the early 20th century thrived in industry. Shipyards and factories provided thousands of jobs. Generations were kept in work by taking up trades. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the city was deindustrialised. Industry was diverted to the new towns. Many were left unemployed.
This used to thrive in industry. They had hundreds of factories in the Helen Street, the rope works, the thermo tank, the chain work, with 3 thriving shipyards, you know, Harlan, Bulls, Fairfield and Stevie's. When they shut down, that was it. We were just left with Fairfields. And we're just building navy boats now. And that took the heart out of government and all.
I know quite a few men who didn't really have a drink problem before they lost their job. Over a matter of just 4 or 5 years, they developed basically an addiction to the pub. Just so men could talk to other men, that was the way it came about. But they didn't realise they became a bit dependent on alcohol, because that was their release. And there was a bit of a downward spiral from there. Work was their life. It's where they socialised. If you were working back in the 70s, a normal working week was 44 hours a week. And so it was the women who really suffered quite badly when the wages stopped coming in. But in most cases, the men, when they lost their jobs, their wives went out to work. There were always more jobs for women, basically because women, you could pay them less. And the man would be left at home, looking after the kids. Some men are equipped for it, most men weren't. They didn't have the social skills to go out gossiping in the clothes the way a woman could.
Premature deaths are 30% higher in Glasgow compared to the rest of the UK. Much of this excess is made up of deaths from cancer, heart disease, alcohol addiction and suicide.
I was brought up in a family of siblings, my mother and father, 3 brothers and a sister. Now my 3 brothers died with cancer, and my sister, she just dropped dead in the middle of the street. Out of the 5 that I'm the only one that left, and funnily enough, I'm the only one that drunk heavy. My father died, and that was the start of my journey in alcohol. Couldn't take it, my father died and leaving it. You know, so I just rolled on, and then the 2 kids came, and I didn't look after them. I was more interested in alcohol, my drink, to make me forget.
When we talk about alcohol, the levels of alcohol harm that affects this problem, it's not small amounts of alcohol harm from people drinking just a little bit too much over many years. This is people dying in their 40s and 50s from alcohol issues. Things like alcohol harm, drugs harm, we see exactly as you say as the consequences of this. There's lots of research that show alcohol and drugs as sort of coping mechanisms for people living in difficult circumstances, and I think you can refer to it as that. You could maybe refer to suicide, if you like, as a non-coping mechanism. So it's a response to the circumstances that people are in. And it's important to emphasise that we're not just guessing or making this up. This is based on firm evidence out there which show these things.
People do not live as long. You know, they only perhaps are living until their 60s, and I think there's been research that shows that in other more wealthy areas, like so I think it was done, it was like the Bear's Den thing, I'm sure it was, don't quote me, but I think it was like late 70s at least, that was the average age where people, so it's huge, but people have just decided that, well, everybody just lives till that time, you know, we all have poor health, so that's acceptable, you know, that's just the way we are because we live in a poor area, and when you're feeling low about yourself, that just becomes accepted, like an accepted type of lifestyle, because all your friends and everybody that you know in your community is like that. They all have a lot of people will have poor health.
Absolutely, an injustice has been done to Glasgow on different levels. There's an injustice in terms of the impact of poverty and deprivation generally on health, especially when we know the effects of poverty and deprivation, and yet we still have those levels and we still don't address them properly, even though we could do. And it's an injustice in terms of all the additional things that have been done to the city, which has resulted in this much, much worse health. So we know what we need to do, and we've listed a whole set of recommendations that would have a beneficial effect. The question now is whether governments will take up those recommendations and run with them.
Excess poverty is not just a social or economic issue, it's a public health issue. As long as deprivation exists, populations will be at risk. The poor health of Glasgow was, until recent years, considered an unexplained phenomenon. Thanks to the people who not only observe the problem, but ask why it's happening and what we can do about it, we have a series of answers. The research has emphasised that economic policies matter for population health. The next step is to respond to the evidence and work towards improving the health of Scotland's population.